If you're seeing this right now, don't scroll away, because there is a reason your eyes landed here at this exact moment. Out of all the videos, all the messages, all the distractions fighting for your attention today, somehow you ended up here. And I want you to consider something. What if the life you've been living isn't the life you're meant to stay in? What if the frustration you've been carrying, the confusion you've been battling, the feeling that something is missing, isn't a sign that you're broken? What if it's a sign that you're waking up? Most people spend their entire lives waiting for confidence, waiting for permission, waiting for the perfect opportunity, waiting for someone to come and tell them they're ready. But life doesn't work that way. The greatest transformations don't begin when everything is perfect. They begin in moments like this. A moment when something deep inside whispers, enough. When enough doubting yourself, enough living according to fear. Enough carrying yesterday's pain into today's possibilities. Because the truth is, the person you are becoming is already trying to emerge right now. Beneath the anxiety, beneath the overthinking. Beneath every story you've been telling yourself about why you can't, there is a stronger version of you waiting to be unleashed. And the beautiful thing is this: you don't need to become someone else. You don't need to earn your worth. You don't need to prove anything to anyone. You simply need to remember who you are underneath all the noise. For years, you've been looking outside yourself for answers, more success, more approval, more achievements, more validation. But lasting change begins the moment you stop searching everywhere else and start listening within. Because hidden beneath every challenge you've faced is a lesson. Hidden beneath every setback is a doorway. And hidden beneath every fear is the life you've been longing to live. Today is not just another day. This is a turning point. Not because of luck, not because of fate, but because the moment you become aware of your own power, everything changes. And over the next few minutes, I want to show you something that could completely transform the way you see yourself, your struggles, and your future. So stay with me, because if you're seeing this, your life may be about to change forever. Have you ever noticed that the people who feel the deepest are often the ones who speak the least about their pain? Not because they don't have anything to say, not because they don't care, but because after a certain point, they begin to understand something most people never learn. They realize that explaining their feelings to someone who has already decided not to understand is like shouting into the wind. The words leave their mouth, but nothing changes. And if there is one thing that causes an empath to quietly disappear from someone's life forever, it is the repeated dismissal of their feelings. At first, it doesn't seem like a big deal. A careless comment here, a sarcastic remark there. A moment when they open up about something that hurt them, and instead of being met with understanding, they're met with judgment. They're told they're overreacting. They're told they're too emotional. They're told they're making a big deal out of nothing. To the person saying those words, it may seem insignificant. It may feel like a passing conversation that will be forgotten by tomorrow. But to someone who experiences the world deeply, those moments leave marks that are not easily erased. An empath pays attention to more than words. They notice tone. They notice energy. They notice what is said and what is left unsaid. They can feel when someone is listening to respond instead of listening to understand. They can sense when their vulnerability is being tolerated rather than respected. And every time their feelings are brushed aside, a small piece of trust disappears, not all at once, not dramatically, just quietly, almost invisibly. The mistake many people make is assuming that because an empath remains kind, they are unaffected. Because they continue showing up, people think everything is fine. Because they continue giving, people assume they can continue taking. But what they fail to see is that beneath the surface, something is changing. Every dismissed feeling becomes another reminder that this may not be a safe place for their heart. Every invalidated emotion becomes another reason to stay silent next time, and that is how distance begins. Not with anger, not with confrontation, not with a dramatic goodbye, with silence. The empath starts sharing less. They stop bringing up what bothers them. They stop expressing what they need. They stop expecting understanding because experience has taught them that understanding is unlikely to come. What once felt like openness begins to feel like risk. What once felt like connection begins to feel like loneliness. Think about what it takes for someone to reveal their feelings. They are handing you something invisible, but incredibly valuable. They are trusting you with fears they don't show the world. They are allowing you to see the parts of themselves that most people never get access to. That kind of vulnerability is a gift, but when that gift is repeatedly dismissed, mocked, minimized, or ignored, eventually the giver stops offering it. Most people believe relationships end because of huge betrayals. Sometimes they do. But many meaningful relationships don't die from one catastrophic event. They die from thousands of tiny moments where one person felt unseen. Tiny moments where their emotions were treated like inconveniences. Tiny moments where their reality was questioned instead of acknowledged. An empath remembers those moments, not because they are keeping score, not because they are looking for reasons to leave, but because every human being needs to feel emotionally safe. And when emotional safety disappears, connection begins to disappear with it. What makes this especially painful is that empaths are often the very people who spend their lives validating everyone else's feelings. They listen when others need to talk. They stay when others are struggling. They offer understanding even when they disagree. They create space for other people's emotions because they know how important that space is. So when their own feelings are dismissed, the contrast is impossible to ignore. Imagine constantly being the person who says, "I understand." Imagine constantly being the person who asks, "How are you really doing?" Imagine constantly being the person who notices when someone is hurting. And then imagine that when it's finally your turn to be heard, nobody listens. That kind of disappointment changes people. Not overnight, but gradually. The empath begins to pull their energy back. They begin protecting parts of themselves that were once freely available. They become more selective about who gets access to their inner world. The warmth remains, but the openness starts to fade. The kindness remains, but the trust starts to weaken. And here's the part many people never see coming. By the time an empath decides to leave, they have usually spent months or even years trying to stay. They have explained themselves repeatedly. They have given second chances, third chances, fourth chances. They have tried different words, different approaches, different levels of patience. They have hoped that eventually they would be understood. The departure is not impulsive. It is the final chapter of a story that has been unfolding for a very long time. That's why when they finally walk away, it often seems sudden to everyone except them. To everyone else, it looks like they disappeared without warning. But the warnings were there, the quieter conversations, the reduced enthusiasm, the growing emotional distance, the moments when they stopped sharing what was in their heart. The signs were present all along. They were simply ignored in the same way their feelings had been ignored. An empath does not expect perfection. They understand that people make mistakes. They understand that everyone has bad days. They understand that misunderstandings happen. What they are looking for is not perfection. They are looking for willingness. Willingness to listen. Willingness to understand. Willingness to care about their emotional experience even when it differs from your own. Because understanding does not require agreement. Respect does not require complete comprehension. Sometimes all a person needs is to hear, "I may not fully understand what you're feeling, but I can see that it matters to you." Those simple words can preserve trust. Those simple words can strengthen connection. Those simple words can make someone feel seen. But when those words never come, something inside the empath begins to close. And once that closure becomes complete, it is incredibly difficult to reverse, because the opposite of love is not hate. The opposite of connection is indifference. When an empath reaches the point where they no longer feel safe sharing their feelings, they stop fighting for the relationship. They stop trying to convince someone to understand them. They stop seeking validation from people who have repeatedly shown they are unwilling to give it. And then one day they leave, not loudly, not bitterly, not with revenge in their heart. They simply choose peace over dismissal, understanding over explanation, and self-respect over the exhausting cycle of trying to be heard by someone who never truly listened. There is something most people never realize about an empath. Their kindness is not weakness. Their patience is not a lack of boundaries. Their willingness to give is not proof that they can give forever. Yet this misunderstanding destroys countless relationships. People become so accustomed to receiving an empath's support, understanding, attention, and care that they begin treating it as something that will always be there. Like a resource that never runs out, like a light that never dims. But every empath eventually reaches a moment when they recognize a painful truth they have been pouring into people who never intended to pour back. At the beginning, they don't mind giving. In fact, helping others often brings them genuine happiness. They find purpose in being there when someone is struggling. They answer late night calls. They listen to the same problems over and over again. They offer encouragement when someone feels hopeless. They celebrate other people's victories. They absorb pain that doesn't belong to them simply because they care. They do these things not because they expect something in return, but because compassion comes naturally to them. The problem begins when generosity becomes expected instead of appreciated, when people stop saying thank you, when people stop noticing the effort, when people stop recognizing the emotional energy being invested on their behalf. That is where the shift starts. Slowly, almost invisibly, the relationship changes. The empath continues showing up. They continue helping. They continue supporting. But over time, they begin noticing a pattern. Every conversation revolves around someone else's needs. Every interaction becomes a one-way exchange. They are expected to listen, but nobody listens to them. They are expected to understand, but nobody tries to understand them. They are expected to care, but nobody asks how they are doing. And because empaths naturally focus on others, they often ignore these warning signs for far too long. They tell themselves people are busy. They tell themselves everyone struggles differently. They tell themselves things will eventually balance out, but balance never comes. The giving continues. The receiving never does. Imagine carrying a bucket of water every day to help everyone around you survive. Every person takes a little. Some take more than a little. Some take almost everything. And because you care, you keep returning with more water. You keep refilling the bucket. You keep convincing yourself that helping others is enough reason to continue. But eventually you look down and realize your own cup has been empty for a very long time. That realization changes everything. Because no matter how compassionate someone is, they cannot survive indefinitely in relationships where they are valued only for what they provide. Human beings need reciprocity, not identical effort, not constant repayment, but some evidence that the care flows both ways. Empaths often become emotional homes for people who are lost. People come to them for comfort. People come to them for guidance. People come to them for healing. And at first that feels meaningful. It feels beautiful. It feels like a purpose. But eventually, a painful question begins to emerge. Who is there for the empath? Who notices when they are struggling? Who checks on them when they disappear for a few days? Who asks about the battles they never talk about? Who notices the exhaustion behind their smile? For many empaths, the answer becomes painfully clear. Almost no one. And that realization creates a kind of loneliness that is difficult to describe, because it is possible to be surrounded by people and still feel completely alone. It is possible to be deeply loved for what you do while feeling unseen for who you are. It is possible to be everyone's support system while having no support system of your own. The empath begins noticing that some people only appear when they need something, a favor, advice, comfort, validation, reassurance. But when the empath needs help, those same people become unavailable. Suddenly they are busy. Suddenly they have other priorities. Suddenly the energy that was freely received is nowhere to be found when it is time to give back. At first, this hurts. Then it disappoints. Eventually, it awakens. Because every empath reaches a stage where they begin seeing relationships more clearly. They stop focusing only on people's words and start paying attention to patterns. They stop listening to promises and start observing actions. They stop asking whether someone says they care and begin asking whether someone demonstrates it consistently. The answers are not always pleasant. Sometimes they discover that they were never truly valued. Only their usefulness was. Their listening ear was valued. Their emotional support was valued. Their availability was valued. Their willingness to sacrifice was valued. But they themselves were not. And once an empath sees that truth, it becomes impossible to unsee. This is why their disappearance often surprises people. The people around them assume everything is fine because the empath rarely complains. They assume the relationship is healthy because there has been no conflict. They assume the connection is strong because the empath continues showing kindness. What they fail to understand is that empaths often suffer in silence. Not because they enjoy it, not because they are incapable of speaking up, but because they spend so much time trying to understand others that they sometimes forget to advocate for themselves. Until one day they remember. And that day changes everything. The empath starts reclaiming their energy. They stop answering every call. They stop solving every problem. They stop rescuing people from consequences they need to face themselves. They stop carrying responsibilities that were never theirs to carry. For the first time, they begin asking a powerful question. What happens if I stop giving so much? The answer reveals everything. Some people stay. Some people leave. Some people become angry. Some people become distant. Some people reveal that the relationship was never built on mutual care at all. And while that realization can be heartbreaking, it is also liberating because it allows the empath to see who genuinely values them and who simply valued access to their energy. The truth is that respect and appreciation are emotional nutrients. Every healthy relationship requires them. Without them, even the strongest bond eventually weakens. Even the most patient person eventually becomes exhausted. Even the kindest soul eventually recognizes that endless sacrifice is not love. Love is not giving until there's nothing left of yourself. Love is not abandoning your needs to meet everyone else's. Love is not allowing yourself to be drained by people who never refill what they empty. Real connection requires mutual care. Real connection requires gratitude. Real connection requires effort from both sides. And when an empath finally understands this, something remarkable happens. They stop chasing people. They stop proving their worth. They stop overextending themselves for those who take them for granted. They begin choosing relationships where support flows in both directions. Relationships where kindness is appreciated rather than exploited. Relationships where their heart is not treated like an endless supply of emotional resources. Because eventually, every empath learns a lesson that transforms their life. The people who deserve their compassion are not the ones who demand it endlessly. They are the ones who recognize its value, the ones who protect it, the ones who return it. And once an empath discovers what genuine reciprocity feels like, they can no longer tolerate relationships built entirely on taking. The door that remained open for years begins to close, not out of anger, not out of resentment, but out of wisdom, out of self-respect, out of the understanding that their kindness was never meant to be consumed without limit. It was meant to be cherished. There is a point in every deep emotional connection where truth becomes unavoidable. Not the truth people talk about casually, not the truth they soften with excuses, but the raw kind of truth that sits underneath behavior. And for an empath, nothing cuts deeper than realizing they are being emotionally manipulated while they are still trying to love someone sincerely. Because empaths don't usually enter relationships looking for control or advantage. They enter looking for connection, understanding, and emotional safety. So when manipulation shows up in subtle forms, it doesn't always get recognized immediately. It gets rationalized. It gets explained away. It gets forgiven more times than it should. At first, it doesn't look like manipulation. It looks like emotional intensity. It looks like someone having a bad day. It looks like misunderstandings that get cleared up and then repeat again. It looks like guilt being used in small doses, just enough to shift responsibility without sounding obvious. It looks like phrases that sound innocent on the surface, but carry weight underneath them. Things like, "After everything I've done for you," or "I guess I just care more than you do," or "You always take things the wrong way." Each one of these doesn't feel like an attack by itself, but over time, patterns form. And empaths are pattern detectors more than anything else. What makes emotional manipulation so powerful against someone empathetic is that they naturally try to understand the other person's pain first. Even when they are the one being hurt, they will pause and ask what the other person to behave that way. Even when something feels wrong, they will search for the intention behind it. Even when their own emotions are screaming for attention, they will silence them just long enough to make space for someone else's explanation. And in that space, manipulation grows quietly. Because manipulation doesn't always arrive loudly. It doesn't always announce itself as control. It often arrives as confusion. A situation feels off, but not clearly wrong. A conversation leaves a strange emotional residue, but nothing directly offensive was said. A boundary is crossed, but it's framed as love or concern or urgency. And over time, the empath begins to question their own perception instead of questioning the behavior in front of them. That is where the real shift begins. Once a person starts doubting their emotional reality, they become easier to influence. Not because they are weak, but because they are trying to be fair. They are trying to see both sides. They are trying to avoid unnecessary conflict. And manipulators, whether consciously or unconsciously, often rely on that fairness to maintain control. The empath is trying to understand, while the other person is trying to win the emotional exchange. One of the most damaging patterns in these dynamics is guilt reinforcement. The empath expresses a need, and suddenly the focus shifts away from the need and onto the discomfort of the other person. The conversation is no longer about what is fair or healthy. It becomes about whether the empath is being too much or selfish or difficult. Slowly, their natural emotional expression becomes something they begin to suppress. Not because it is wrong, but because it consistently creates tension they don't want to deal with. Over time, the empath starts adjusting themselves instead of addressing the situation. They start choosing silence over honesty. They start minimizing their feelings before sharing them. They start filtering their truth so carefully that it barely resembles what they actually feel anymore. And from the outside, the relationship may still look functional. Conversations still happen. Messages still get exchanged. Time is still spent together. But internally, something important is breaking down. Authenticity is being replaced with emotional self-editing. The most dangerous part of manipulation is not the dramatic moments. It is the normalization of small distortions. The gradual acceptance of emotional imbalance as something that just is. The empath begins to think that maybe this is what relationships are supposed to feel like. Maybe misunderstanding is normal. Maybe constant emotional adjustment is part of caring. Maybe feeling slightly drained is just at the price of connection. But deep down, there is always a quieter awareness, a subtle internal signal that something doesn't feel aligned. And this is where emotional intelligence becomes both a gift and a burden. Because empaths don't just feel their own emotional shifts, they feel the shift in others too. They can sense tension before it is spoken. They can detect insincerity even when the words sound perfect. They can feel when someone is using emotion as leverage rather than expression. And yet, despite sensing all of this, they often stay longer than they should. Not because they don't see it, but because they hope it will change. Hope is where many emotional traps deepen. The empath remembers the good moments. They remember the genuine connection that existed at the beginning. They remember the version of the person that felt safe, kind, or understanding. And they keep trying to reach back to that version, believing that if they just communicate better, love harder, or understand more deeply, things will return to what they once were. But manipulation rarely exists in isolation. It often coexists with just enough affection to keep hope alive. That mixture creates confusion. Because it is not purely negative, it is inconsistent. And inconsistency is one of the most psychologically destabilizing experiences in any relationship. One moment there is closeness, warmth, and emotional bonding. The next moment there is distance, guilt, or emotional pressure. The nervous system begins to stay alert, constantly trying to predict which version will appear next. And the empath, who naturally tries to bring harmony into emotional chaos, starts working harder to stabilize something that may not be meant to stabilize. Eventually, something shifts internally, not loudly, not dramatically. It is a quiet recognition that no amount of understanding is changing the pattern. No amount of patience is resolving the imbalance. No amount of empathy is creating mutual emotional responsibility. And in that realization, something powerful begins to happen. The empath stops trying to decode the behavior and starts observing the impact. They stop asking, "Why is this happening?" and start asking, "Why am I still accepting this?" That question changes everything. Because once emotional clarity arrives, manipulation loses its power. It depends on confusion. It depends on self-doubt. It depends on emotional silence. But when a person begins to trust what they feel again, the distortion breaks. The empath starts recognizing that love should not require constant emotional negotiation just to feel respected. That care should not feel like a test of endurance. That connection should not require sacrificing inner peace just to maintain it. And when that realization fully settles in, something quiet but irreversible happens. The empath no longer argues, no longer over-explains, no longer tries to fix what keeps repeating itself. They begin to detach not from love, but from confusion, not from care, but from distortion. And from the outside, it looks like withdrawal, it looks like distance, it looks like someone slowly fading away. But internally, it is something else entirely. It is clarity returning. It is self-trust rebuilding. It is the decision to no longer stay in emotional environments where truth has to be constantly defended just to exist. When an empath finally chooses to leave, it rarely looks like a storm on the outside. There are no loud announcements, no dramatic final arguments, no need to prove a point. It often looks like silence that arrived gradually, like a door that was never slammed but slowly stopped opening. And that is what makes it so difficult for people to understand in the moment. It doesn't feel like an ending until it is already complete. But from the empath's side, it was never sudden. It was every moment their feelings were minimized and they stayed quiet instead of speaking up. It was every time they felt emotionally unsafe, but tried to rationalize it into something manageable. It was every time they understood others deeply, but felt misunderstood in return. It was every time they gave the benefit of the doubt, even when their intuition was already speaking clearly. And eventually, something inside them stops negotiating, not because they stopped caring, but because they stopped abandoning themselves to keep a connection alive. Here is what most people miss about that moment. The empath doesn't leave when the pain becomes the worst. They leave when hope stops outweighing self-respect. And once that shift happens, No amount of explanation, apology, or emotional intensity can reverse it because the decision is no longer emotional confusion. It is emotional clarity. That is why their absence feels so final, not because they became cold, but because they finally became honest with themselves. So if you're hearing this and recognizing someone like that in your life, understand something most people learn too late. Emotional safety is not built in grand gestures. It is built in the smallest moments of respect, consistency, and acknowledgement. And once someone no longer feels safe being emotionally honest with you, they don't announce their departure twice. They simply stop showing up where they are not seen. And if you are the empath in this story, there is another truth hidden underneath everything. You were never meant to stay in places where your depth was treated like inconvenience. You were never meant to keep explaining your heart to people who only heard what benefited them. You were never meant to shrink your emotional world just so someone else could feel comfortable inside it. Because the moment you start disappearing from yourself just to remain in someone else's life, the relationship has already stopped being mutual. And the real turning point is not when you leave them. It is when you stop leaving yourself. So the question isn't who stayed or who left or who understood you in time. The real question is simpler and far more uncomfortable. How long did you stay where you had to stop being you just to be accepted? And once that question finally lands, everything else starts to change.